as if they were happy once he was consuming stories. It was summer once again, so David had plenty of time to read. His father had tried to encourage him to make friends with the children who lived nearby, some of them evacuees from the city, but David did not want to mix with them, and they in turn saw something sad and distant in him that kept them away. Instead, the books took their place, the old books of fairy tales in particular, so strange and sinister with their handwritten editions and new paintings, had increased David's fascination with these stories. They still reminded him of his mother, but in a good way, and whatever reminded him of his mother equally helped keep Rose and her son Georgie at a distance. When he was not reading, the window seat gave him a perfect view of one of the property's other curiosities, the sunken garden set into the lawn close to where the trees began. It looked a little like an empty swimming pool, with a set of 4 stone steps leading down to a rectangle of green bordered by a flagstone pathway. While the grass was regularly mown by Mr. Briggs, the gardener, who came every Thursday to tend the plants and lend nature a helping hand where necessary, the stone parts of the sunken garden had fallen into disrepair. There were large cracks in the walls, and in one corner the stonework had crumbled away entirely, leaving a gap big enough for David to squeeze through if he had chosen to do so. David had never gone further than poking his head in, though. The space beyond was dark and musty and filled with all kinds of hidden scurrying things. David's father had suggested that the sunken garden might make a suitable site for an air raid shelter if they decided it should ever become necessary, but so far he had managed only to pile sandbags and sheets of corrugated iron in the garden shed, much to the annoyance of Mr. Briggs, who now had to navigate his way around them every time he wanted to reach his tools. The sunken garden became David's own place outside the house, especially when he wanted to get away from the whispering of the books or from Rose's well-intentioned but unwelcome intrusions into his life. David's relations with Rose were not good. While he tried always to be polite, as his father had asked him to be, he did not like her, and he resented the fact that she was now part of his world. It was not merely that she had taken or was trying to take the place of his mother, although that was bad enough. Her attempts to cook meals that he liked for dinner, despite the pressures of rationing, irritated him. She wanted David to like her, and that made him dislike her even more. But David believed that her presence also distracted his father from the memory of David's mother. He was forgetting about her already, so tied up was he with Rose and their new baby. Little Georgie was a demanding child. He cried a lot and always seemed to be ailing, so that the local doctor was a regular visit to the house. His father and Rose doted on him, even as he deprived them of sleep almost every night, leaving them both short-tempered and weary. The result was that David was increasingly left to his own devices, which made them both grateful for the freedom offered by Georgie and resentful of the lack used to any conversation with him that did not center on food or bedtime, or that was not conducted in surely monosyllables, immediately embraced the chance to build bridges between them, so David's acting abilities were not stretched very far. She dried her hands on a dishcloth and took a seat beside him. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, a little tired, what with Georgie and all, but that will pass. It's been a little strange this last while. I'm sure you feel the same way, the four of us all thrown together suddenly like this. I'm glad that you're here, though. This house is too big for one person, but my parents wanted to keep it in the family. It was important to them." "Why?" asked David. He tried to keep himself from sounding too interested. He didn't want Rose to realize that the only reason he was talking with her was to find out more about the house, and particularly his room and the books that it contained. "Well," she said, "this house has been in our family for a very long time. My grandparents built it and lived in it with their children. They hoped that it would stay in the family and that there would always be children living in it." "Did they own the books in my room?" asked David. "Some of them," said Rose. "Others belonged to their children, my father, his sister, and—" She paused for a moment. "Jonathan," suggested David, and Rose nodded. She looked sad. "Yes, Jonathan. Where did you learn his name?" "It was written in some of the books. I was wondering who he was." "He was my uncle, my father's older brother, although I never met him. Your room was once his bedroom, and a lot of those books were his. I'm sorry if you don't like them. I thought it would be such a nice room for you. I know it's a little dark, but it had all those shelves and, of course, the books. I should have been more thoughtful." David looked puzzled. "But why? I do like it, and I like the books too." Rose turned away. "Oh, it's nothing," she said. "It doesn't matter." "No," said David. "Please tell me." Rose relented. Jonathan disappeared. He was only 14. It was a long time ago, and my grandparents kept his room exactly as it had always been, because they hoped that he would come back to them. He never did. Another child disappeared with him, a little girl. Her name was Anna, and she was the daughter of one of my grandfather's friends. He and his wife died in a fire, and my grandfather took Anna to live with his family instead. Anna was 7. My grandfather thought it would be good for Jonathan to have a little sister and for Anna to have a bigger brother to take care of her. Anyway, they must have wandered off and, oh, I don't know, something happened to them and they were never seen again. It was just very, very sad. They searched for them for so long. They looked in the woods and the river, and they asked after them in all of the nearby towns. They even went to London and placed drawings and description of them anywhere that they could, but nobody ever came forward to say that they had seen them. In time, they had 2 more children, my father and his sister Catherine, but my grandparents never forgot Jonathan and never stopped hoping that he and Anna might someday come home. My grandfather in particular never recovered from their loss. He seemed to blame himself for what happened. I suppose he thought he should have protected them. I think he died young because of it. When my grandmother was dying, she asked my father not to disturb the room, but to leave the books in their place just in case Jonathan should ever return. She never lost hope. She cared about Anna too, but Jonathan was her eldest son, and I don't think a day went by when she didn't stare out the window of her bedroom in the hope of seeing him walk up the garden path, older but still her son, with some wonderful tale to tell of his disappearance. My father did as she asked. He left the books as they were, and later, after my father and mother died, so did I. I always wanted a family of my own, and I suppose I just felt that Jonathan so loved his books that he would have liked to think there might be another little boy or girl in there someday who would appreciate them instead of them being left to decay unread. Now it's your room, but if you'd like us to move you to another one, we can. There's lots of space. What was Jonathan like? Did your grandfather ever tell you about him? Rose thought. Well, I was as curious about him as you are, and I would ask my grandfather about him. I made quite a study of him question, he found that the bookshop was gone. It was boarded up. Nobody lived or worked there anymore, and no one could tell him what had happened to the little man who owned it. Perhaps he died. He was very old, my grandfather said, very old and very odd. The doorbell rang, breaking the spell of harmony between David and Rose. It was the postman, and Rose went to greet him. When she returned, she asked David if he would like something to eat, but David said no. Already he was feeling angry with himself for lowering his defenses against Rose. Even if he had learned something as a result, he didn't want her to think that everything was now all right between them, because it wasn't, not at all. Instead, he left her alone in the kitchen and headed back to his bedroom. On the way, he looked in on Georgie. The baby was fast asleep in his crib, his big gas helmet and the pillows for pumping air into it lying close by. It wasn't his fault that he was here, David tried to tell himself. He didn't ask to be brought into this world. Still, David couldn't rouse himself to care terribly for him, and something tore inside him each time he saw his father holding the new arrival. He was like a symbol of all that was wrong, of all that had changed. After his mother had died, he had been just David and his father, and they had become closer as a result, because they had only each other to rely upon. Now his father had Rose too, and a new son, but David, well, he didn't have anyone else. It was just himself. David left the baby and returned to his garret, where he spent the rest of the afternoon flicking through Jonathan Tovey's old books. He sat in the window seat and thought that Jonathan had sat in this seat once upon a time. He had walked the same hallways, had eaten in the same kitchen, played in the same living room, and even slept in the same bed as David. Perhaps somewhere back in time, he was still doing all of those things, and both David and Jonathan were now occupying the same space, but at different stages in history, so that Jonathan passed like an unseen ghost through David's world, unaware that he shared his bed each night with a stranger. The thought made David shiver, but it also gave him pleasure to think that two boys who were so much alike somehow shared such a connection. He wondered what could have happened to Jonathan and to the little girl Anna. Perhaps they had run away, although David was old enough to understand that there was a great deal of difference between the kind of running away that happened in storybooks and the reality of what would face a boy of 14 with a girl of 7 in tow. It wouldn't have taken them long to become tired and hungry if something had made them run away and to regret what they had done. David's father had told him that if he ever got lost, he was to find a policeman or ask a grown-up to find one for him. He wasn't to approach men who were by themselves, though. He was always to ask a lady or a man and woman together, preferably ones with a child of their own. You couldn't be too careful, his father would say. Was that what happened to Jonathan and Anna? Had they talked to the wrong person, someone who didn't want to help them get home, but instead had spirited them away, hiding them in a place where no one would ever find them? Why would someone do that? As he lay on his bed, David knew there was an answer to that question. Before his mother had finally left for the not-quite hospital, he had heard her discussing with his father the death of the local boy named Billy Golding, who had disappeared on his way home from school one day. Billy Golding didn't go to David's school, and he wasn't one of David's friends, but David knew what he looked like because Billy was a very good soccer player who played in the park on Saturday mornings. People said that a man from Arsenal had spoken to Mr. Golding about Billy joining the club when he was older, but someone else said that Billy had just made that up and it wasn't true at all. Then Billy went missing, and the police came to the park 2 Saturdays in a row to talk to anyone who might know something about him. They spoke to David and his father, but David couldn't help them, and after that second Saturday, the police didn't come back to the park again. Then, a couple days later, David heard in school that Billy Golding's body had been found down by the railway tracks. That fast as he could, and if the man tried to follow him, then David was to go up to the first house he came to and tell them what was happening. Whatever else he did, he must never, ever go to a stranger, no matter what the stranger said. David told her he would never do that. A question came to him as he made the promise to his mother, but he did not ask it. She looked worried enough as it was, and David didn't want her to worry too much that she wouldn't even let him go out to play. But the question stayed in his mind, even after she turned out the light and he was left in the darkness of the room. The question was, but what if he made me go with him? Now, in another bedroom, he thought of Jonathan Tovey and Anna and wondered if a man from a clean little house, a man who lived with his mother and kept sweets in his pocket, had made them go down with him to the railway tracks. And there, in the darkness, he had played with them in his way. That evening at dinner, his father was talking about a war again. It still didn't feel to David as if there was a war on. All of the fighting was happening far away, even if they did get to see some of it on newsreels when they went to the pictures. It was a lot duller than David had expected. War sounded quite exciting, but the reality so far had been very different. True, squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes often passed over the house, and there were always dogfights over the channel. German bombers had been carrying out repeated raids on airfields to the south, even dropping bombs on St. Giles, Cripplegate in the East End, which Mr. Briggs described as typical Nazi behavior, but which David's father explained rather less emotively as a botched effort to destroy the Thames-Shaven oil refinery. Nevertheless, David felt removed from it all. It wasn't as if it was happening in his own back garden. In London, people were taking items from crashed German planes as souvenirs, even though nobody was supposed to approach the wrecks, and Nazi pilots who bailed out provided regular excitement for the citizenry. Here, even though they were barely 50 miles from London, it was all very sedate. His father folded the Daily Express beside his plate. The newspaper was thinner than it used to be, down to 6 pages. David's father said that it was because they had started rationing paper. The Magnet had stopped printing in July, depriving David of Billy Bunter, but there was still the boy's own paper every month, which David always filed carefully alongside his Aircraft of the Fighting Powers books. "Will you have to go and fight?" David asked his father once dinner was over. "No, I shouldn't think so," his father replied. "I'm more used to the war effort where I am." "Top secret," said David. His father smiled at him. "Yes, top secret," he said. It still gave David a thrill to think that his father might be a spy, or at least know about spies. So far, it was the only interesting part of the war. That night, David lay in his bed and watched the moonlight streaming through the window. The skies were clear, and the moon was very bright. After a time, his eyes closed, and he dreamed of wolves and little girls, and an old king in a ruined castle, fast asleep on his throne. Railway tracks ran along the castle, and figures moved through the long grass that grew beside them. There was a boy and a girl, and the crooked man. They disappeared beneath the earth, and David smelled gumdrops and peppermints, and he heard a little girl crying before her voice was drowned out by the sound of an approaching train. That's it